Good morning. Today I will be sharing with you some of the more recent archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land and how they relate to the Hebrew Bible, or what we call our Old Testament. With so many biblical sites and a large number of ongoing excavations, it seems like every week there is a new find which changes archaeologists' understanding of earlier times. For myself, each time I'm in the Holy Land, I return to some of the same sites and take the tour again. There are always changes, often large changes, in thinking based on the latest discoveries. This is one of the reasons that the field of biblical archaeology continues to hold our attention. Before we explore some sites, let's look at how modern biblical archaeology began. It is traced back to the 1837 expedition of Edward Robinson. He was the first explorer to use a combination of knowledge of the Bible, ancient biblical languages, and biblical geography to identify the location of sites mentioned in the Old and New Testaments. Edward Robinson was somewhat of a hometown boy from Clinton, New York. His uncle was Seth Norton, a professor and second president of Hamilton College. Edward graduated from Hamilton as valedictorian in the class of 1816. He taught the ancient languages at Hamilton and other colleges and spent 4 years studying in Germany. It was there that he began planning for his trip to the then Ottoman Palestine. Robinson and his traveling companion, Reverend Eli Smith, began their journey in Cairo, Egypt, and eventually finished in Beirut, Lebanon. Reverend Smith was a former student of Robinson's and had spent years as a missionary in Lebanon. His fluency in Arabic was invaluable. By the way, these trips of Robinson were at least partially funded by the sales of land near Clinton, which had been owned by his deceased wife, Eliza, who was the youngest daughter of Samuel Kirkland. Robinson and Smith traveled with only one helper who did the cooking. They usually traveled by mule. When they approached a site of interest, Smith would ask a local resident the name of the place. Since the names of the sites often retain a similarity even after millennia, they were often able to match the present Arabic name with the ancient Hebrew name. For example, the Hebrew Anathoth, which was the birthplace of Jeremiah, was now the Arabic Anata. Bethel, a high place of worship, was Beten. El Ram, the hometown of Samuel's parents, is Ramlah, and Panias, the New Testament Caesarea Philippi, became Banias. Panias became Banias because in Arabic there is not a P sound. Robinson published his biblical research in Palestine in 1841. Its publication fueled great interest in Europe and America and launched numerous expeditions to the Holy Land in the 1840s and 50s. With this background, let's see what attracts archaeologists. Often it is a tell or tell, the same. Tell is Hebrew for hill. For example, Tel Aviv, the largest city in Israel, means hill of spring. But Tel Aviv doesn't interest archaeologists much because it wasn't founded until 1909. Tell also means mound. Mounds are of great interest because they may indicate successive layers of cities. For example, Tel Jericho has over 20 layers of civilization, one on top of the other. This site has been settled for 8,000 years because of nearby springs, which make the areas an oasis. Tel Megiddo, or in Greek, Armageddon, was a city fortress with a strategic location overlooking the main ancient road in the Jezreel Valley. It has at least 26 different layers of settlement. Let's now examine Tel Dan. Dan was the northernmost city of the 12 tribes of Israel. The phrase "from Dan to Beersheba" appears 9 times in the Hebrew Bible to refer to the settled area of the Hebrew nation. Tel Dan is one of the most attractive places in Israel because it is well watered with lush foliage. This is one of the primary sources of the Jordan River. The snowmelt from Mount Hermon is the source of the water, which bubbles out of the earth between the rocks. Here we are standing on a footbridge overlooking the stream. My wife and Beth and I were there in February with the pastor and his wife from the church we attended in Iowa. We were reminded of John 7:38. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. As a border city from the 10th to the 8th century BC, Dan was fortified with stone walls and a strong entrance gate built on stone. During the 1993-94 dig, archaeologists were sifting through rubble and found pieces of stone with ancient inscriptions. When the pieces were fit together, it was realized that it was part of a stelae. A stelae is a commemorative slab. The stelae was erected by an Aramaic king celebrating a 9th century BC victory over his two southern neighbors, the king of Israel, meaning the northern kingdom, and the king of the house of David, or the southern kingdom. Few discoveries have caused as much excitement because this was the first historical evidence of the existence of King David outside of biblical accounts. This significant discovery was instrumental in interpreting finds at the next site we'll look at, Khirbet Qeiyafa. Khirbet Qeiyafa overlooks the Elah Valley in the Judean foothills, or what is referred to as the Shephelah. The Elah Valley is known as a place where David and Goliath fought. The Shephelah lies between the mountainous area to the east, which was the kingdom of Judah, or southern Israel, and the lowlands of the Mediterranean Sea, which was Philistia. This area was often a place of contention between the two nations. Excavations began in 2007 and continued until 2013. A fortified city was exposed, which was from the time of King David in the late 11th century BC. As the city was only in existence for 30 or 40 years, there was just one layer of strata to interpret. This is unusual and makes interpretation much easier. The site offered new evidence that the early kingdom of Judah was bigger and more advanced than some scholars believed. Instead of a simple agrarian society with few fortified cities, excavators found a palatial structure which probably served as the central administrative building of the region. The population is estimated to have been between 500 and 600 people. As we look at the excavated areas, we see a series of small rooms built along the city wall. This was a configuration only found in Israeli city fortresses of the time period. The small rooms were used by inhabitants as sleeping rooms. If the city was threatened by invaders, the rooms would be filled with stones, which would increase the strength of the outside walls. Just as archaeologists were about to wrap up the excavations, they uncovered an incredible find, a second city gate. No other site from the period had more than one gate. This enabled the dig director to identify Khirbet Qeiyafa with the biblical Sha'ar Arayim, which is Hebrew for two gates. One gate led to the road to Philistia, and the other gate connected with the road to Jerusalem. We move further south to Lachish, which is also located in the Shephelah. During the 9th and 8th centuries BC, Lachish was regarded as the second most important city in the kingdom of Judah after Jerusalem. The tell spans more than 18 acres and has a palace fort and walls around the entire city. Of most importance is the six-chambered complex used to defend the gates. Gates were the weakest part of a city's defense because they were made of wood and vulnerable to ramming and torching. The gate area was protected by soldiers in towers on both sides of the gate and by a series of inner gates. I visited Lachish in late January of this year. The area of the gates was well protected from weather and visitors. I have never seen such extensive protection of a site in Israel. As you can see, all this looked very new. I guess that there had been something recently very important found here. When I got home, I read about what had been discovered. The winter 2016 excavation fully exposed the gate complex, which measures about 80 feet by 80 feet. Remnants of storage jars were discovered, some of which bore the stamp, "Belongs to the king," which may be evidence of King Hezekiah's preparations against the Assyrian king Sennacherib's impending attack in 701 BC. A large room was discovered that appears to be a shrine. The room contained two four-horned altars whose horns had been intentionally damaged. The archaeologists believe that the destroyed altars were referred to in King Hezekiah's reforms to centralize worship in Jerusalem and abolish it elsewhere. In 2 Kings 18:4, we read, "He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles." The most surprising find was a seat carved out of stone with a hole in the center. Yes, it's what you think it is. It is believed that this latrine was a form of desecration of the shrine room. In 2 Kings 10:27 says, "They demolished the sacred stone of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal, and people have used it as a latrine to this day." However, laboratory tests suggest that this toilet was never used, so perhaps its presence was more symbolic. We now look east to the capital of Judea. I like the quote from Rabbi Nachman, where he says, "Wherever I go, I am always traveling to Jerusalem." In Jerusalem, we first look at the broad wall, which was built during King Hezekiah's expansion of the city of Jerusalem. Jews from the northern kingdom migrated south after the Assyrian conquest of the kingdom of Israel around 721 BC. The immigrants settled outside the city walls on the west. To protect them, Hezekiah fortified the area with a wall. In the 1970s, the remains of a 23-foot wide wall was unearthed. Evidence was found that indicated Hezekiah had to destroy houses in order to build the wall. We read in Isaiah 22:10, "You counted the buildings in Jerusalem and tore down houses to strengthen the wall." On my first trip to the Holy Land, I was wandering around the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. The entire quarter had been rebuilt since the 1970s. I walked by an archaeological site which caught my attention. I stopped to read the signage which talked about a broad wall. I later looked up the Bible reference. Just imagine walking around for an hour or two in Jerusalem and seeing this from King Hezekiah's time, then something from Byzantine times, King David, the early Muslims, the British Protectorate, the time of Jesus, etc. This happens all the time when exploring the Holy Land and can be exciting but also very confusing. This is what archaeologists deal with, sifting through a jumbled mass of rubble to discover, identify, and interpret artifacts from multiple time periods. In the ancient Near East, clay bullae were used to secure the strings tied around rolled-up documents. The bullae were made by pressing a seal onto a wet lump of clay. The stamped bulla served as both a signature and as a means of ensuring the authenticity of the documents. In the 1980s and 90s, many bullae were found during the excavation of the city of David. This was the first area settled by the tribes of Israel under King David. Most of the bullae were no longer legible, but one had the name Gemariah ben Shaphan, which means Gemariah son of Shaphan. He is mentioned in Jeremiah 36:10 as being King Jehoiakim's scribe. This evidence helped identify the buildings discovered as part of the royal city during the First Temple period, which began in 960 BC with the construction of the temple by Solomon and ended in 586 BC with the temple's destruction by the Babylonians. In 2005 and 2008, bullae with recognized Hebrew names from the first temple period were found again. Gedaliah son of Pashur and Jehukal son of Shelemiah were two ministers of King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. As told in Jeremiah 38, they plotted unsuccessfully to kill the prophet Jeremiah by throwing him in a pit. In 2012, a bullae was found that had the first ancient artifact showing evidence of the existence of Bethlehem, which is mentioned many times in the Old Testament. It was a fiscal bulla used to seal tax shipments to the IRS of the Kingdom of Judah in the late 8th and 7th century BC. The shipment was dispatched from Bethlehem to the king in Jerusalem. Bethlehem is first mentioned in Genesis 35, 19, and 47 concerning the death and burial of Rachel, the wife of Jacob, who was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Finally, in 2015, the royal seal of King Hezekiah was found. The bulla, which measured just over a centimeter in diameter, bears a seal impression of a two-winged sundial. Its Hebrew inscription reads, "Belonging to Hezekiah ben Ahaz, king of Judah. He reigned from 715 to 686 BC and is known for his religious reforms." Remember, I spoke earlier of the discoveries at Lachish, where his reforms desecrated the old shrine. Today, Hezekiah's name is associated with a water tunnel. Hezekiah's tunnel was cut out through bedrock in 701 BC under the city of David. Why did Hezekiah order the tunnel built? The explanation is found in 2 Chronicles 36, 1 through 4. The tunnel was designed to bring water from the Gihon spring, which is located outside the city walls and is vulnerable to attack. It went through the bedrock of the eastern hill to the west side. This is where Hezekiah's city of Jerusalem was expanding and protected by the new broad wall, which we have already seen. The tunnel flowed into the Siloam Pool Reservoir. The tunnel was forgotten for many centuries. It was rediscovered in 1838 by, you guessed it, Edward Robinson. Visitors to Jerusalem today can actually walk through the tunnel. The water level is about calf deep in most places and hip high at the entrance and exit. The trip takes about an hour, but takes about a half hour, and you need to bring a flashlight, as there is no light in the tunnel, looking much the same as it did in Hezekiah's day. The journey through the tunnel is a high point for my wife, Beth, who has gone through several times. However, I haven't. There are several very low areas where the average person needs to duck. The guys who built the tunnel are a bit smaller than I am. So the trip wouldn't have been particularly enjoyable for me. During tours, I always take the alternative, which is an older Canaanite tunnel that predates the water tunnel. While it is dry, it's still a little small for me, but at least I'm not hitting my head all the time. As we have seen, archaeology has aided in corroborating many of the sites and narratives of the Hebrew Bible. Particularly amazing is the fact that most of the finds I've described this morning were 21st century discoveries. With only about 1% of the Holy Land excavated, we wonder what else will be found that strengthens the biblical accounts with factual evidence. Thank you.